Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well. As we all know, Baldur's Gate 3 is one of those games where every rock, every line of dialogue, and every random NPC feels like it's hiding something. From hamsters mourning their dead owners to fake crash sites, the game is filled with tiny little details that most of you would never see even if you've poured hundreds of hours into the game. So today I wanted to take you all through some of my favorite useless pieces of Baldur's Gate 3 information, going through some hidden references, early access changes, and so much more. As always, if you have any of your own weird and useless facts about this game that's not mentioned in the video, I'd love to hear them down below. Also quickly, if you enjoy this type of content, please consider subbing to the channel and dropping a like, and without further ado, let's get right into it. The very first piece of useless information on this list is in regard to a dialogue option you might have seen near the start of Act 3. When you first try to enter the lower city of Baldur's Gate, you'll be met by the Still Watch, who asks for your name to register you, and one of the options you can give them is something absolutely ridiculous, being Daisy Dewdrop Fluffington. To me, the best part about picking this option is that from that point forward, every single Still Watch construct in the city will greet you by that name, with all the robotic sincerity you've come to expect. So somewhere in the official records of Baldur's Gate, there is now a legally recognized citizen named Daisy Dewdrop Fluffington, and I don't know about you, but I find that quite hilarious. It's really the sort of useless and wacky detail that makes this world feel alive and absurd at the same time. This is one of my favorite random references in Baldur's Gate 3, and I think a lot of you will find it pretty cool as well. Again, in Act 3, tucked away among the busy city streets, you can find a man by the name of Geezer Loris, who's crying over a pile of cabbages spilled across the floor, and that's his whole existence. He's sobbing and muttering about his beautiful cabbages, seemingly oblivious to the larger events going on around the city. Of course, if you didn't already clock it, this is a direct reference to the cabbage merchant from Avatar: The Last Airbender, who famously lost his cabbages in a bunch of episodes. Now, Larian didn't just stop there though, because if you're playing as a monk, you'll even get special dialogue with him, as if you're Aang himself. So yep, there exists a character in the game whose only purpose is to simply be a reference to the longest running joke in an animated TV show. Now, this is something that I don't think many of us have seen in action for themselves, including myself, but I had to include it in here. If for some reason you decide to play the game through with friends who all choose the Bard class, you'll stumble upon one of the game's most useless but strangely beautiful mechanics. As you all know, as a Bard, you can choose to play any instrument, either it be a lute, a flute, or whatever, and if multiple players start performing at the same time with different instruments, it won't just be pure unfiltered chaos. Instead, the game will actually sync them together in harmony. The rhythms will align and the notes will blend together, making you feel like you're suddenly a part of a medieval music band. Of course, this is something that Larian definitely didn't need to add in, but the fact that he accounted for it is just another reason why this game is as good as it is. I'm actually curious about how many people know about this, because I definitely didn't, but it's not one that is super hard to find. Your camp in Baldur's Gate 3 is of course filled with a variety of different characters, from warriors to monsters, but one of the most quietly human details in the game sits right next to Karlach's tent. If you hover your cursor near her tent, you'll see a small worn out teddy bear with the name Clive. He doesn't do anything and you can't interact with him, but he just exists. And really, I find that quite perfect. For a character like Karlach, who we all know as the fiery tiefling who tears through legions of devils with her bare hands, even she still carries a little stuffed bear from her past. It's such a small detail that most of us will never notice, but for the ones that do, it really tells you everything about who Karlach really is. Back in the game's early access, Astarion had one of the strangest weaknesses of any companion. Essentially, if he tried to cross moving water, either it be a river or even a shallow current, he would actually start taking damage, simply by being in the water. Of course, this was a leftover nod to general vampire lore, where typically they can't cross running water without succumbing to some sort of harm. Now, obviously, this would have turned exploration with Astarion into a bit of a nightmare in certain parts, like the swamp near Auntie Ethel's house, so Larian did remove it before the game's launch. This is something that I'm glad was removed, because it would have definitely made exploring a lot more difficult. And honestly, it makes sense that Astarion's ability to go into the sun due to the effects of the tadpole would also extend to him being able to tolerate a bit of running water. I think we all know Wyll as the sort of heroic and clean-cut character amongst the game's companions, but back in early access he had a moment that gave him just a little more volatility. Early in Act 1, if you simply ignored his request to go after the Goblin camp, he'd get super angry with you and would even curse you out for it, which is of course the complete opposite of his character in the actual game. In fact, not listening to Wyll in this instance would actually lock you out of having any sort of high approval with his character, not just for Act 1, but for the rest of the whole game. Of course, Larian would rewrite Wyll into the more humble and heroic type we see in the actual game, and pretty much any remnant of this more tempered Wyll is non-existent. I'm personally happy with this change, but I am curious, do you think they should have kept some element of this in the actual game? Let me know down below. Staying on the topic of Wyll for a bit longer, we've got another element of his character that was cut from the game's early access. We all know Wyll as having a grand entrance where he swoops in from above and kills a goblin, but originally this wouldn't always go to plan. In the game's early access version, that particular scene was tied to an actual dice roll, so if Wyll failed the check, he'd miss the mark on his landing, face planting into the dirt, and would sometimes even die to the same goblin he was supposed to kill dramatically. It's definitely one of those absurd early access editions that just captures Larian's philosophy in that really anything can happen, but in a way I also like it. To me, the idea that one of our main companions could wipe himself out during his own introduction is so ridiculous that I kind of wish Larian could have kept some form of this in the actual release. When you first meet Karlach in Act 1, it's easy to assume that the scorched pod near her is the one that she crashed in, as it perfectly fits that her pod would be affected by her fiery nature, but it's actually not hers. Instead, that pod actually belongs to Minthara. Again, back in the game's early access, the area around Karlach was part of a completely different storyline, one where Minthara's pod may have connected their stories more closely, but when the narrative changed, Larian simply left the wreck there without any true explanation of who it belonged to. Now, it's a small environmental detail that I don't think many of us would ever notice, but to me it's a fascinating snapshot of how the game's world and stories progressed throughout its development. It kind of reminds you that even in a game as well crafted as Baldur's Gate 3, every little detail can tell the tale of a half-buried storyline. Okay, this one's kind of crazy, but basically before Larian gave us the ability to knock out Minthara as a way of recruiting her, some people in the community decided to get a little creative. Essentially, this was a sort of convoluted exploit to get Minthara as a companion through turning her into a sheep. Now, I know that sounds kind of crazy, but the now infamous Sheep Thara method became an actual way in which people would recruit Minthara on non-evil playthroughs. First, you'd have to beat Minthara in Act 1 in a specific way, and then wait all the way until Act 2. From there, you'd find her glitched but still awake body, polymorph her into a sheep, and then use Dominate Beast on the sheep. From here, you'd simply teleport back to Moonrise Towers, and then through sheer improvisation, you had to weapon carry Sheep Thara to the throne room for judgment. This is of course absolute chaos, but in many ways it shows the level of freedom Baldur's Gate 3 gives you, and that you can really break the game in any way you want. For a name that's almost become synonymous with Baldur's Gate 3, Tav actually started out as something completely random. During the game's development, Larian used the codename Project Gustav for the game, and Gustav wasn't a mysterious figure or anything in particular, but it was actually the name of Sven Vink's dog. But of course somewhere along the way, the name Gustav shortened into Tav, and that placeholder name eventually stuck to the player character and is now canon across millions of playthroughs. So every time that a companion says Tav, they're technically calling you by the nickname of the dog of Larian's CEO. It's definitely the kind of behind the scenes trivia that perfectly fits the game, and it's honestly kind of endearing that your legendary hero who saved the world of Faerun is actually named after a dog. Neil Newbon is of course one of the most significant actors in all of Baldur's Gate 3, doing the performance for one of the greatest companions in Astarion, and most of us know him for that role, but his fingerprints are actually everywhere in the game. For example, when the actors for Gortash and Minsk weren't available for full motion capture, Neil actually stepped in and performed for both of them. In addition to that, he even played Gale's disembodied hand in that opening portal scene. So yeah, when you think Gale is waving to you through that portal, it's actually the hand of Astarion's actor. Of course, this is something that's impossible to ever notice, but it's still pretty cool to know about. So now you know that in various scenes for both Gortash and Minsk, it's not actually their actors behind the screen, but instead it's the actor for Astarion himself. This next one is pretty similar to the last one, and it's a pretty interesting detail in relation to Wyll's actor. Theo Solomon, who is the actor behind everyone's favorite warlock, didn't just bring the Blade of Frontiers to life, but he actually voiced the Baldur statues that you'll find in Wyll's quest in Act 3. So when this quest eventually ties into the legacy of Baldur, the original hero of Baldur's Gate himself, you're literally hearing the same voice echoing across 2 generations of legends. To me, it's a subtle but almost poetic connection, as the man who's been searching for redemption is voiced by the same person who plays the city's very founder. Now again, most of us would never catch this, and it's of course never alluded to, but it's still there all the same. So Wyll isn't just fighting for Baldur's Gate, but in a weird way, he is Baldur's Gate itself. As we all know, Baldur's Gate 3 had a pretty lengthy early access period, with many visual changes happening through the years that eventually landed us the game we got in 2023. But what if I told you that many of the companions that you know and love barely resemble their early access selves? Well, let's take Gale for example, who used to look very different. His face was much rounder, his beard more unkempt, and even his hair generally looked quite different to what we see in the actual game. Even Shadowheart's design shifted as well, with her scar being moved slightly and her whole look becoming much more refined by the game's full release. But even more so than both of these companions, the beloved tiefling in our camp, Karlach, saw the biggest transformation of them all. Her old model looked way closer to a generic tiefling before Larian eventually rebuilt her into the confident and battle-worn warrior that we all know today. Here's another small yet almost heartbreaking detail that not many of us will find in Baldur's Gate 3. If for some reason you decide to kill Minsc or he permanently dies in any other way, his small hamster companion Boo, who's been with him since the days of the original games, doesn't just vanish alongside him. Instead, he'll stand over Minsc's body, even sadly squeaking in grief, refusing to move no matter what you do. You can't talk or interact with him, and even using speak with animals just won't work. He'll just continue to keep squeaking, mourning his fallen friend in the only way he knows how. It's such a tiny and easily missable thing, especially if you're not paying attention, but it definitely does carry this strange emotional weight. To me, it's amazing that in a world filled with the clashes of devils and mortals, it's the smallest creature who shows the purest loyalty, even with no dialogue at all. Somewhere in Act 1, hidden inside the Githyanki creche, you can find a food item called Grilled Miniature Giant Space Hamster. Now I know what you're thinking, what in the world does that mean? Well, it's not an item that has a quest or any sort of big implication, but it's just a sort of quiet, dark joke. Now for any of you who've played the original Baldur's Gate games, it's pretty obvious that this is a reference to Boo, Minsc's legendary hamster companion. Personally, this sort of morbid yet weirdly on brand joke fits perfectly in this world, where every corner is always hiding something new or weird to check out. It's not got much utility beyond giving you 10 camp supplies, and you certainly can't sell it for very much. But even so, to me, it's one of those tiny details that shows just how many layers of humor are tucked into this game. This one is something that I actually think a lot of you would have seen, especially if you've played through the game more than once. Withers is of course the mysterious undead skeleton that we meet inside of a crypt, who casually offers you resurrection services for mere pocket change. But a lot of us would have missed in our first playthrough that the game can actually tell you exactly who he is within the first few hours. If you explore the dank crypt near the crash site in Act 1 and pass a high enough religion check, your character can recognize imagery that's tied directly to Withers through a subtle reference to a forgotten god. Of course, this is a breadcrumb in a trail that will eventually become much clearer by the game's ending, where it's kind of obvious that Withers is in fact Jurgle himself, and when you look back on it, it's clear that this early hint was whispering the truth to you the entire time. In the House of Hope, there's a shield that most of us would completely miss, and it belongs to the very person who the house is named after. Hope, Raphael's imprisoned captive, actually carries a shield that has the highest armor class of any shield in the entire game, giving you a +4 in AC. Of course, it's easy for you to miss, because 1, the focus is on confronting Raphael himself and retrieving the Orphic Hammer, but also because you would have to kill Hope in order to get it. It's not exactly the flashiest item in the world, as it's got no unique aesthetic and kind of just looks like a generic silver shield. Honestly, I don't think it's worth it at all, especially this late into the game, and to me it defeats a lot of the purpose of even going into the House of Hope in the first place. Nonetheless, it's still pretty interesting to know that the game's best shield is in fact the one belonging to Hope. Now, I've got to say, this is probably my favorite piece of so-called useless information in this entire video. In Act 3, there's an easily missed NPC who's an aging Mind Flayer hunter who's long since hung up his weapons. He'll actually tell you that he hasn't been the same since his last hunt, and that he will never fully recover. Of course, on the surface, this doesn't exactly mean all that much, but there's actually a heartbreaking story behind his character. Larian actually added this NPC as a tribute to a fan's father, a man who used to love Dungeons and Dragons before being diagnosed with Alzheimer's. So the NPC's fading memory and his fractured mind is actually all a quiet nod to that real story. It's really one of those beautiful moments that reminds you just how much of this game was made with heart, and that even the smallest characters carry real human stories. Before the game's full launch, Baldur's Gate 3 had a very different face behind your dreams. In the game's early access, the being who whispered to you in your dreams wasn't the Emperor, but instead it was Daisy, a sort of seductive, dreamlike figure who appeared as your guardian. However, the whole setup leaned more into temptation instead of choosing your guardian, with the voice asking you of who you dream of at night. Of course, Daisy's role was later rewritten into the Emperor, but the DNA of Daisy is still there, with the voice in your mind and the strange pull towards trust and corruption. In fact, even the game's main theme, Down by the River, that plays during the dream sequences was actually written for Daisy. And I don't know about you, but I can still feel the echoes of this lost version of the character within the Emperor, who still whispers to you just like Daisy once did. Okay, now our very last bit of useless information is something that weirdly makes Baldur's Gate 3 feel way more connected to the larger D&D universe than what you'd initially realize. The events of the game actually take place just a few years before the Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves movie, and in terms of location, it's actually just a few days by boat from the Sword Coast. That means canonically, while your party's out there fighting mind flayers and gods, Edgin the Bard might have actually heard of your party's various adventures, and this timeline actually lines up almost perfectly, as Baldur's Gate 3 happens around 1492 DR, whereas the movie sits in the late 1490s. It's a pretty small thing of course, but it's a type of tiny crossover that to me makes the world of Faerun feel just a bit more alive and a lot more interesting. And that wraps up about 15 minutes of some useless albeit fun information and trivia about Baldur's Gate 3. Together these small yet fascinating details work to build a world that feels alive in a way that very few games can ever manage. You can really spend hundreds of hours in this world, but still stumble onto something completely new, and really that's the magic of it all. Anyway, that's all from me for today's video. If you enjoyed, please consider subbing to the channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 and RPG content, and I'll see you all in the next one. Peace.